Okay, so just to give an example of where I'm sort of starting from, we've all come across addiction-type metaphors. So here's one from the New York Times fairly recently. Well, much has been said about how people descend into this world of QAnon. Little is known about how they get out. Those who leave are often filled with shame. Sometimes their addiction is so severe that they have become estranged from family and friends. So we use the language of addiction a lot in terms of extreme belief. And we also use the language of addiction for people who have left, like, recovering Catholics and so forth. And what I want to do is to take this seriously. It's not metaphorical in some cases. It is literal. And you can, in the context of this conference, I think you can think of this as a way of being more precise about some of the extreme beliefs that fall under the umbrella that we call extreme belief. Which covers a lot of things that are not addiction, right? Just as alcoholism covers a lot of varieties of drinking that don't count as alcoholism, right? So it's not that that's analogous, it's that there are parallel sorts of variation in the way beliefs, what we call extreme beliefs are held. So what I want to define and talk about are the extreme beliefs that count as addictions, which I call doxastic addictions because they involve belief. So let me just say a bit about, in case I don't get through everything. First of all, take home is the addiction is not metaphorical in some cases of extreme belief. I also think there's likely a neurobiological component to doxastic addiction and thus to extreme belief. We've really been talking about psychological, socio-psychological mechanisms so far. I think there's also an actual neurobiological aspect. And in terms of responsibility, which is what this workshop is sort of connecting to, doxastic addicts have impaired cognitive autonomy in the same way that you think of a stereotypical drug addict has impaired autonomy. And so reduced responsibility. And this does play out in legal contexts as well. Okay, so what is an addiction? Just to start us off, well, there's no necessary and sufficient conditions. There's a lot of individual variability, although there's typically neurophysiological changes. There are typically behavioral and cognitive markers of poor decision making. But there's no one set thing that is kind of universal. Substance ingestion is not required, so we have gambling addiction. So doxastic addiction is a perfectly comprehensible concept. What comes closest to a necessary condition is just this loss of control over their use, right? And in this case, it's a loss of control over what one believes, one's first order beliefs. It's a matter of degree, as I mentioned, and what isn't often recognized is that most addicts, people that we will call addicts, do stop, are able to stop with sufficient incentives. So, for example, famously, pilots, may be addicted to certain, drugs that keep them functioning because they're of lack of sleep. And when they're threatened with losing their jobs because of random drug testing, most of them manage to get off stop using the drugs, right? So it's a general feature of people that we do consider addicted, that if the incentives are strong enough, the motivations are strong enough, they do manage to stop. So loss of control over use. There's also a pragmatic additional clause to this, which is that it leads to negatively judged social consequences. We don't generally diagnose somebody as being an addict unless it has started to have consequences for their family, for their job, for their communities, and so forth. Okay. All right. So what's a doxastic addiction, right? Special case, right? Just as heroin addiction is a special case of addiction. The target here is not a drug that you ingest. It's a first order belief. So you are no longer in control of that belief. And you can think of beliefs as things that we use. They're tools that we use to guide action. So there's nothing, untoward about thinking about not being in control of something that we use. So if you think of, as an example, Sandy Hook was a bunch of crisis actors, for example, is one belief that some people have about that massacre. That's the type of belief I'm taking as an example. So one is no longer in control of believing that Sandy Hook was a bunch of crisis actors. And this has socially harmful consequences. In this particular case, threats made to the parents, denials of that their kids were actually killed, and all that. And I should say, let me just, because this committed religious belief, we've talked about that in terms of extreme belief. I don't think most, that's not what I'm talking about here. There's fuzzy lines between all of this, but when we talk about committed religious belief, we do not imply that person is not in control of their belief, and we don't imply that their belief has negative social consequences. And the same with vice epistemology, the same thing, right? We do not imply that the vicious, right, are not in control of their belief, right? I suggest a certain psychological mechanism for this, which is, a loss of capacity for reasonable trust in a particular person who's the source of the belief. So it's a second-order belief about the first-order belief, or what one might say doubts about the belief. These doubts, these second-order beliefs, are not properly responsive to evidence that the source of the testimony should not be believed. Okay, so what's the difference then between, say, doxastic addiction and then vice, right? So if somebody's closed-minded, that's one of the vices of epistemology. They still maintain their cognitive autonomy. I haven't seen any discussion of epistemic effect, even just thinking about it in terms of vice, has this moralizing component, obviously, where the person is in control of what they're believing. They're just like choosing not to, look at certain evidence, or they dismiss it or whatever. The addict, however, is not fully autonomous in what they believe, right? I mean, that's one of the differences. And again, as a diagnostic, one way to sort of see the difference between somebody who's just merely vicious and somebody who's actually addicted is providing strong negative consequences, right? So just a case in point, the lawyer Sidney Powell, one of Trump's lawyers, said, the 2020 election was rigged. Once she got under oath, right, she says, well, no reasonable person would have thought these claims of fraud were fact, right? So once the rubber hit the road and she had to, and there were severe consequences of her lying under oath, then she kind of walked it back, okay? So she wasn't an addict, but I'm sure some of the people that she was talking to are. Okay, what's the difference between doxastic addiction and an echo chamber, or a cult for that matter? I don't think everybody in an echo chamber or in a cult is a doxastic addict, right? I mean, so as long as you are still sort of entertaining second-order beliefs about your belief, doubts, that sort of a thing. Even if you don't act on it, if you're too afraid, that's a different story, right? And an addict is somebody who really has a real inability to, or if they do act on it, they relapse, or they're unable to stop believing in a way. So Nguyen has this analysis about echo chambers where he says, these are metaphorical walls that are built by creating a disparity of trust, right, between the people who are the subjects of the trust manipulation and the outside world. Don't trust those people, trust me, right? So again, not everybody in an echo chamber is automatically thereby an addict. Question, how responsive are they to evidence of the testifier's unreliability? And how much social damage has occurred, right? So again, because of his analysis, he's not thinking in terms of addiction. He suggests that, in order to get out of the echo chamber, you use what he calls a Cartesian reboot, right? Kind of just start all over. And from a doxastic addiction perspective, that's the equivalent of going cold turkey, right? It works sometimes, but for the most part, it doesn't work. Okay. So final point would be permissible restrictions, right? all of the discussion today hasn't really talked about, well, what sort of restrictions can we put if we have a free speech environment on these cult leaders, right? On any, religious believers, or, QAnon, conspiracy theories, right? I mean, we're awash with all this kind of misinformation, and that's why we're here today, right? But we're also living in free societies where people can say what they want, including lies and all kinds of things. So doxastic addiction, of course, is, well, can we restrict? Are there any sorts of restrictions that you can adopt in a legal free speech regime? And I think you can. I think the concept of doxastic addiction can help us see how to do that, right? So a speech act of somebody like Alex Jones or somebody who's trying to what they're trying to do is manipulate the person's cognitive autonomy. People are differently vulnerable to that, right? So it's partly a matter of your own initial vulnerabilities. So what I call doxastic pushing is a particular kind of speech act. It's content neutral, so it's not like you're restricting a particular kind of content. It's what you're trying to do with it, right? Which is undermine cognitive autonomy. Of course, people's cognitive autonomy is the basis for free speech, right? That's why we have a free speech regime. So if you're not trying to rationally persuade, unlike brainwashing, it's not abrupt. It doesn't involve physical capture, but it is a speech act that aims to restrict exactly the sort of thing that a free speech regime presupposes, right? So I think there can be justifiable restrictions, just as we have justifiable restrictions on drugs. We have different drug regimes, right? So the idea here would be, in general, if you could show, again, this is not easy, but if you could show that somebody is intending to manipulate somebody's cognitive autonomy, and if there is actual harm done to those people. So that's it.